Hey guys, I hope you guys are all staying positive during this latest remote learning phase and stay on top of your work. Be positive. Reach out to me or others if you need help. But stay on top of your work, pass your classes. I hope everything's going well. You can see them in my kind of cluttered up classroom here. I'll give you a little view here. Let's flip it around. There we go. You can kind of see the room there, and my kids kind of drew all over the board there. All right, guys. So for week 14 here, chapter 14, Preston Brooks, who's a U.S. House of Representative member out of South Carolina, he's going to attack a Massachusetts U.S. Senator Charles Sumner. And this shows this growing intensity of sectionalism. Remember that term means like the tensions, the conflict between North and South leading up to the U.S. Civil War. But basically, Charles Sumner, this anti-slavery guy in Massachusetts, had basically given a fiery speech against slavery, and he even alluded to this concept that slave owners were having relationships with slave women. The South was outraged by it, and a group of Southerners came up where Charles Sumner is working at his desk. They form a circle around Charles Sumner so no one can break up what's about to happen. Preston Brooks, with his metal-plated cane, then starts beating the crap out of Charles Sumner, causing him like severe damage. Charles Sumner wasn't able to serve for a while he's recovering, but severely beats Sumner with his cane, does Preston Brooks. While Southerners kind of form a circle so nobody can break it up. And Preston Brooks is forced to resign, but South Carolina reelects him anyways. Charles Sumner, while he's recovering and can't serve, Massachusetts leaves his U.S. Senate seat empty as a sign of the Southern barbarity. But it actually helps the Republican Party out quite a bit because a lot of Northerners start following the Republican Party more after they're outraged by the South's actions and the outpouring of the South in favor of what Preston Brooks did. In fact, a lot of Southerners would send by mail Preston Brooks canes and gold-plated canes and things like that, and say that, the only problem that they had with Preston Brooks is he broke a perfectly good cane, stuff like that. But it shows you that the conflict between North and South. We touched on the Mexican-American War this past week, but keep in mind the Mexican-American War, it exacerbates the tensions between North and South. Two examples of this are the Wilmot Proviso. We get all of this land out west. And remember, the North and South are constantly in conflict about what are we going to do with the land out west? Are we going to allow slavery to expand westward, or is this going to be free states for free labor? And the Wilmot Proviso says Mexico had recently outlawed slavery. Therefore, when we acquired this land, slavery wasn't legally allowed there. Let's keep it that way. And it passes the U.S. House of Representatives, where the North has a strong edge. But in the Senate, it has a historical trend of being 50-50 between slave states and free states. Plus, there's always a few northern senators who are friendly towards slavery. So it gets blocked in the Senate. And a lot of Northerners start wondering, is it true when people say that the Mexican-American War was nothing more than the land grab in order to create new slave states? And a lot of people start believing it, which amps up the tensions between North and South even more. And then you get these famous spot resolutions where Abraham Lincoln, a very young one-term House of Representative member, challenges Polk, saying, show me the spot on the map where Mexican soldiers killed American soldiers. If it's on U.S. soil, I'll say it's a just war. If it's not, it's basically the slave land grab again. And Polk had made the argument for going to war, arguing that Mexican soldiers had killed Americans on American soil. And Lincoln knows that's technically not true because the U.S. soldiers were attacked in the disputed zone where they really weren't supposed to be to begin with. Therefore, he's kind of pointing out that Polk had kind of mislead the nation when he asked to go to war. I'm going to kind of gloss over the Compromise of 1850 because I have like a 10-minute or 15-minute, something like that, video just in the Compromise of 1850. But real quick rundown, a lot of people say the Compromise of 1850 ended up delaying the U.S. Civil War by a decade. Henry Clay, this great compromiser who had made the tariff compromise and the Missouri Compromise and some other things, Basically, Henry Clay had helped mold this compromise of 1850, but as some people point out, it might have not really been a compromise because they had to break it up into chunks and they couldn't get a majority to pass it as a whole. And it was basically like, all the Southerners voting for this and then just a few Northerners. All the Northerners voting for this and then just a few Southerners. Is that really a compromise? Or, when it's only actually a few people flipping back and forth to compromise and the vast majority are voting on strict north-south lines. But anyways, you got 5 big parts to this. The one, you have a new, tougher fugitive slave law. And this new, tougher fugitive slave law greatly upsets the South. In fact, the North. And the North is actually talking, like, what about our state rights? Because now these northern states, they have to help slave catchers, give them assistance, give them use of their jails, give them use of their sheriffs and things like that, to help catch runaway slaves into the North. And there are even some legally free black people who are kidnapped by these runaway slave catchers. And the court system stacked against the black person who was kidnapped by the slave catcher. And so this is very, very controversial. I go into more detail in my other video. This is a fugitive slave law is a huge win for the South. California enters in as a free state. That's a huge win for the North. There still are some people, because California is a vast wilderness back then, but there still are some people who have slaves, but technically the state legally doesn't have it. There's still a lot of slave interest in California at the time, but technically it is a free state, technically speaking. The Utah territories, which is like modern-day Utah and Nevada, and the New Mexico territories, which is modern-day New Mexico and Arizona, they could potentially be slave with popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty basically just means that the people who live there get to vote. And so this is kind of up in the air. A lot of people thought that, hey, slavery would never take hold because it's arid, it's desert, it's, you're not going to have like vast cotton plantations or tobacco farms and things like that. But some people have pointed out slavery could take hold. And in fact, there's like some silver mines that are later discovered in this area. And in theory, you could have slaves working that. But anyways, Texas, they give up some land in exchange for their debt being paid off. Texas used to even be bigger. It's a huge state, second only to Alaska in terms of area. But here's something. A lot of foreign dignitaries said, they didn't like seeing slave auctions when they would visit the nation's capital. And obviously it's because slavery is evil, but they would it was kind of like, let's sweep it under the rug. Let's just not have people see it. So they basically said no buying or selling slaves in Washington, D.C. You can still own slaves in the nation's capital. You just can't buy or sell slaves. And remember, the District of Columbia, generally speaking, is a small geographic area. It doesn't take that far to travel outside to Maryland or Virginia, where you can buy and sell slaves. So this is more just for looks. It doesn't really make any big changes. It's just trying to hide some of the evils of slavery from foreign visitors when they would see slave auctions and families getting broken up and split up, showing you kind of how evil it is. But the Compromise of 1850, a lot of people say it delays the U.S. Civil War for about a decade. And during that time, keep in mind, the North is growing rapidly. We're growing more in population, we're growing more in factories, we're growing more in railroad lines. So it actually kind of, arguably, if this does delay the Civil War for 10 years, it arguably helps the North get stronger than the South, because the North is just growing quicker than the South during the 1850s. Popular sovereignty becomes this big concept championed by Stephen Douglas, this white Northern Democrat out of Illinois. And he says, look, the local residents should choose to have it be a slave state or a free state. And Southern Democrats tend to support it, even though they wanted all territory should just be opened. But they generally gave it positive lip service. And Republicans, generally speaking, oppose it. Republicans say, hey, we need to keep slavery out of the territories, or it will keep us out of the territories. Because a lot of white Northerners felt that they can't compete against slave labor. And so if slavery is allowed to expand west, middle-class white farmers and other whites will not be able to thrive out west, competing against rich whites, Southerners who move out west, who bring slaves with them. The Free Soil Party forms, and it draws a lot of abolitionists, but it's not technically an abolitionist party. It says we need to stop the expansion of slavery westward. Martin Van Buren, a former president, the guy who Andrew Jackson picked to be the next president after him, the 8th president, Martin Van Buren, he is a candidate for the Free Soil Party for a while. And you can see this growing resistance to slavery's expansion. The Free Soil Party, some people actually think, maybe even cost Henry Clay an election at one point, drawing votes away from him. But the Free Soil Party, you can see the special party for a special interest. You can see the slavery issue is dividing the country apart. The Whig political party, there are two big parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. The Whig political party falls apart on north-south lines. The Whigs adopted a lot of the old Federalist lines, tariffs to support industry and a more national bank type system. Government being a little bit more proactive, but they fall apart. And they actually kind of formed to kind of criticize Andrew Jackson. But they fall apart in north-south lines because the Southern Whigs do not agree with the Northern Whigs on issues like, should slavery expand westward? Should we give more power to slave catchers? Things like that. So the slavery question destroys the Whig Party, and the two-party system of the Democrats and the Whigs falls apart and enters this new modern Republican Party. This is the modern Republican Party. This is the Republican Party that exists today. It gets created in 1854. Some people say it gets created in Jackson, Michigan. Other people say Ripon, Wisconsin. There's actually a little debate between the towns about where it was actually created. But the fact of the matter is, Republican Party draws a lot of Free Soilers, Northern Whigs from the broken Whig Party, but Northern Whigs. And even some Northern Democrats cross over to join this Republican Party. The Republican Party supports tariffs, supports business, active government, helping build railroads and things like that. The Republican Party is going to pass laws like government funding for colleges, like with the Moral Land Grant Act and some things like that. But their biggest issue, their key issue, the keystone issue of the Republican Party's foundation is not abolition, but stopping the expansion of slavery, something that abolitionists would support, but also white non-abolitionists would support. Remember, a lot of whites who didn't care, and they should have, but a lot of whites who didn't care about slavery on moral grounds cared about slavery on economic grounds. We don't want to see slavery expand to new areas, new territories, new states, because we don't want to compete against slave labor, was a common thing. And so this Republican Party was actually huge in rural northern areas, mid-sized towns and rural northern areas. Republican Party still to this day is huge in rural areas. Well, think about it. If the modern Republican Party, when it's formed in 1854, is talking about like government helping railroads grow, what do rural and mid-sized towns in the North want? They want to be connected to railroads, connected to the world. And so you can see why they would draw in a lot of that. Tariffs, they could draw in a lot of support from big business. But one of the key things that rural Northerners were farmers. And if you're a farmer, you might want to move further west, or your kids might move further west, or your grandkids might move further west. You know that one day. And so the fact of the matter is, if you're a rural Northerner, you do not want to see slavery expand. The Republican Party has always done well in the small northern towns, rural northern towns, mid-sized northern towns, has always done extremely well. And still to this day, they do very well in rural Michigan. In fact, although Trump had won in 2016 and lost in 2020, he wins the vast majority of counties both times in Michigan, because he's picking off all these little northern rural counties in Michigan that the Republicans have always done well. The Republicans have always kind of catered to rural northern interests, among other interests too. 1854 KansasNebraska Act. The 1854 KansasNebraska Act is very controversial and upsets a lot of Northerners. Stephen Douglas kind of helps pushes this. He's that Democrat out of Illinois who supports popular sovereignty. The KansasNebraska Act permits slavery in a place where the Missouri Compromise had banned it. Popular sovereignty for Kansas-Nebraska territories. Let me kind of go over here. So, guys, the Missouri Compromise had said in the old Louisiana Territory, which is, kind of like all up through here, all up through there, there'd be no, except for Missouri, there'd be no slavery north of this 3630 line right here. And so this would always be free. This would always be South. The Kansas-Nebraska Act undoes it because it says the Kansas territory and the Nebraska territory went all the way up to Canada back then. But in the Nebraska territory, it could potentially have slavery if the people there wanted it. And so it undoes the Missouri Compromise, which greatly upset a lot of Northerners. And it greatly was supported by the Southerners, because here's a spot where hey, there's some good farmland in there, and here's a spot where slavery was excluded, by the Missouri Compromise back in 1820, that now could be open to slavery potentially here with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So it's a potential win for the South with popular sovereignty. So it was very controversial in the North. It was more supported in the South, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, because Kansas and Nebraska are territories. There's a lot of great interest in terms of when they become a state, are they going to be a slave state? Are they going to be a free state? And the majority of Northerners are saying it should be a free state. The majority of Southerners are saying, hey, it should be a slave state. And you get this because now you can vote. Kansas was more ready to become a state back then. Nebraska wasn't ready. Kansas is ready. So now Kansas is getting ready to become a state, and you literally have white people killing white people in Kansas about whether or not they're going to become a slave state or a free state. That's how out of control it's getting. White people killing white people in Kansas over whether or not the state is going to be free or slave. And it's called Bleeding Kansas, or sometimes you see it as Bloody Kansas, but just this almost like a civil war within Kansas, and people coming across the Missouri state line into Kansas to kind of influence it in favor of slavery often. And the pro-slavery forces, they passed this fraudulent vote where they say they won, and they didn't. There were more pro-free people in Kansas than pro-slave people, but there's this fraudulent vote, and it's obvious it's fraudulent. Like, there's more votes than people there. There's like they find votes that like mirror the Cincinnati address directory, and so it's obviously fraudulent. And the pro-slavery forces create this Lecompton Constitution with this vote, and then they try to ratify Kansas as this new slave state. The Lecompton Constitution legalizes slavery. It ultimately fails because the Northern House of Representatives, the U.S. House of Representatives, controlled by Northern interests, refused to accept Kansas as a slave state, even though Buchanan, the president, was pushing for recognition of Kansas as a slave state. And so, but you can see the tensions over the expansion of slavery westward. You even have this thing called the Austin Manifesto, where various Southern leaders, and Franklin Pierce, a president, had wanted to try to take over Cuba by conquest or buy it to expand slavery. Oh, Cuba, you can grow tobacco. It's great things for farming potentially there. And we could add Cuba, and Cuba could be a new slave state. There are various Southerners over the years who have their eyes set on taking land to the South in order to try to get new slave lands for new slave states. The Know Nothing political party, also known as the Native American Party. Now remember, Native just means born here. I'm a native Michigander because I was born in Michigan, right? So don't think Native American as in like Cherokee, Potawatomi, something like that. Think Native American as they're born here. They oppose immigrants. And this starts in the Northeast because the Know Nothing political party, they think that immigrants are taking the job, especially the Irish Catholic immigrants. They're anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic. Sometimes they're actually progressive on some women's issues and other issues, surprisingly. But the fact of the matter is they're saying, look, they're taking our jobs, they're changing our culture. These people are going to be more loyal to the Pope than they are to the Constitution, things like that. Young Abraham Lincoln once said something to the effect of, if the Know Nothing political party gets their way, they will change the Declaration of Independence to say all men are created equal except for the Negroes, except for the Irish, except for the Catholics. And then it goes through like a long list, and then none of us will be equal. But they're called the Know Nothing political party because at first they're like a kind of like a secret society, like a closed group, and people ask like, where were you? You went into that building with a bunch of what was going on in that meeting. Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. And so they were nicknamed the Know Nothing political party for a while. This is arguably the worst arguably the worst Supreme Court case of all time. Scott v. Sanford, 1857. Chief Justice Tawney, I've always heard it's pronounced Tawney, not Taney, but Tawney makes this ruling. Buchanan, who's widely considered to be one of, if not the worst president we've ever had, they were going to make a small ruling, and Buchanan had wind of the ruling and said, no, make a big splash. And then Tawney comes back with this big splash, and it just tore the country apart. People are literally killing people over slavery's expansion westward, and this ruling's just like throwing gas on a fire. First of all, the ruling says black people can't be citizens. So people like Dred Scott, who's this slave who was brought from Missouri to Illinois, a free state, for a couple of years, and then up to the Wisconsin territory, modern-day Minnesota, which is a free territory, for several years. And then he's saying, basically, I'm free because I've been here. And he's being told, no, you're not. And so it goes to court. Basically says black people can't be citizens. And then the South is then going to use this to argue, well, there's a few New England states, like Massachusetts, for example, that's allowing black men the right to vote. Well, wait a minute. They shouldn't be doing that. Slavery can't be restricted from the territories. So at a time where we've had at least a few compromises, although they weren't perfect, slavery can't be restricted from the territories. Because before it was assumed that some of the territories could form territorial governments and exclude slavery with the territorial government or not. Now, slavery can't be restricted from the territories. It just opens up a huge can of worms, and Northerners are paranoid that slavery is going to kind of become ingrained everywhere in these territories, and they will never be able to get it out. Abraham Lincoln, in the 1858 U.S. Senate election that he loses to the famous Douglas that we had talked about earlier, not to be confused with Frederick Douglass, the African-American who escaped slavery, but in the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 here, as he's running against Stephen Douglas, Lincoln says, hey, there's going to be a time where we may go to, the good citizens of Illinois may go to bed at night dreaming of the day when their sister state, Missouri, becomes a free state, only to wake up in the morning and find by court edict, referencing this ruling right here, that Illinois has become a slave state. Because wait a minute, if Dred Scott has lived in a free state or free territory for like over a decade and is still considered to have always been a slave, what makes a free state a free state? If Southerners can move to northern states and bring slaves, and the slave is still a slave, what makes it a free state at that point? And so this is often considered the worst Supreme Court ruling in U.S. history. It just first of all, like obviously this right here is just huge. The blacks can't be citizens, but also at a time when there's so much tension over slavery's expansion, to be dropping down rulings like this, and he was always a slave for every second, even though he lived in a free state or free territory for over a decade at that point, a little bit in Illinois, a longer time in the Wisconsin territory. And so, this just tears the country apart. John Brown, Harpers Ferry raid. We're going to talk more about that this week here. So I won't go into too much detail, but John Brown's a white abolitionist, and he pledges to give his life to help free the slaves. He knows Harriet Tubman, he knows Frederick Douglass, and he and some other men, including some of his sons, are going to lead an armed insurrection to take over Harpers Ferry, which holds the biggest armory, which is like a facility that holds weapons, in this case for the federal government. And he claims he's going to take it over, and he's going to pass out weapons to the slaves, and then they're going to peacefully march around freeing slaves and only fight back people who use violence against them. And to make a long story short, his raid fails. He gets captured. It deeply divides the nation. The South is outraged. They see him as this terrorist. Many Northerners say what he did was wrong, but his heart was in the right spot. And even the Northerners saying what he did was wrong, but his heart was in the right spot, it deeply offends the South. It deeply scares the South. They're already afraid of Nat Turners. Now you have white people potentially using violence to free slaves. It's just too much. and it deeply divides the North and South even more. A lot of people think that this just heightens the tension so much that it's just beyond repair between the North and South over the slavery issues. When you have John Brown, and certainly not all, but many people in the North, kind of making excuses for him. What he did was wrong, but his heart was in the right spot. And many Northerners even kind of like saying, good for him. It's just too much at this point. And finally, the 1860 election. This is a rematch of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, kind of. There's 4 major candidates, 2 in the South, 2 in the North. You have Lincoln and Douglas, both from Illinois. And basically, the northern states have so much more people, they control the electoral college. And Lincoln wins the election without needing a single vote in the South. In fact, he wasn't even on the ballot in many southern states. He didn't get like a couple votes here and there in the South, but he doesn't need a single southern state. He wins every free state. Well, New Jersey, he kind of splits. I think it was like 4 electoral votes and then 3 for Douglas. And I think Douglas technically won the overall part of the state, but they had a weird way of splitting their votes back then. New Jersey did. But to make a long story short, Lincoln gets the North, wins the election. But yet he only has just a hair under 40% of the popular vote. South Carolina said, if Lincoln wins, we're going to secede, because Lincoln had made various statements. Lincoln had said things like, if slavery isn't wrong, then nothing is. Lincoln had said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. We cannot long endure half slave, half free. And he makes all sorts of statements against slavery. And South Carolina says, if he wins, he's so hostile to slavery, we're going to break off. Lincoln wins. South Carolina breaks off. 6 more states break off, up to 7. Lincoln calls up the U.S. Army and calls up the northern states to help put it down, and all the loyal states. That calls 4 more southern states to break off. Those ones were Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and I believe Arkansas was the other one. And so now we have 11 slave states that have broken off. 4 slave states don't break off: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And believe it or not, West Virginia is actually going to break off of Virginia because they didn't want to break off with the rest of the state. So West Virginia becomes a state. But keep in mind, Lincoln never said he was going to free all the slaves if elected. He said he would stop the expansion of slavery. He said slavery was evil, but he said the president can't snap his fingers and free the slaves. He says, I can't free the slaves. Now, the South says he says that. The South puts lots of words in his mouth. The South claims he's going to try to force intermarriages between the races and all sorts of horrible things on them that they don't want. And Lincoln never says half the things the South puts in his mouth. But Lincoln technically said one of the biggest misconceptions is students think Lincoln runs for election saying he's going to free the slaves. He never says that in 1860. Now, by 1864, he's saying it when he's running for re-election. But in 1860, he's not. He just says, I'm going to stop the expansion of slavery. No new slave territories, no new slave states, is what he's saying. All right, kids, have a good day. Stay out of trouble.